logic and emotion. In certain contexts, politics will always be a mix of it, right? And it's self-reference that unless you're passionate about things, you will not do anything about it. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Now, the title we came up with, or I proposed, was Azadi and Democracy in the Times of Hindutva Fascism. Now, Azadi, and some of you were there in the previous lecture that was 3 to 4 days ago. So for you, it might be a bit of repetition, but I'll try not to repeat a lot. But others may not have been there, therefore I have to say some of my ideas about what does Azadi mean. Now, Azadi, broadly speaking, is the notion of freedom. Now, it's not the notion of liberty. Liberty is defined in terms of Western political theory, but that's still very narrow, because liberty in Western political theory is largely individual. Azadi has, since 19th century, if you look at the South Asian context, or if you look at the context of the Kurdish movement, Azadi is more than liberty. Azadi is about freedom. Now, in recent times, what we have found is people have talked of, and it's rightly so, people talked of Azadi from hunger, Azadi from oppression, Azadi for the queers, Azadi for women, Azadi for minorities, and these are very important aspects of freedom. That you can't talk of only political freedom, you also need to look at social, economic, cultural, other forms of freedom. In that context, having a rich and comprehensive notion of Azadi is very important. But it's also crucial to remember that social, economic and cultural ideas of freedom do not replace political idea of freedom. So if we say Azadi from this or Azadi from that, and if we somehow keep quiet about political issues of Azadi, then we are being disingenuous, or we are being problematic in our understanding of Azadi. Now remember, with all kinds of decolonization that took place in various parts of the world, let's say in India 1947, political decolonization, there was a recognition from various progressive forces that this Azadi, this decolonization is not complete, because the colonization of mind still goes on. And this Azadi is not complete because all that has happened is the color of the rulers has changed. So from the white, you have got brown or brownish white or whatever rulers you get now. But maybe applying fair and lovely, I don't know whether it existed then or not, but a certain hue, you got labels of that kind. But that's all changed. Otherwise, more or less, it was similar. So there was a lot of movement or a lot of argument made by the progressives that we need a richer understanding of Azadi that includes cultural, economic, social, other forms of freedom. But that never implied not talking of political freedom. So in Kashmir context, or context of anyone who's struggling for political freedom, if we talk of, oh, let's focus first on Azadi from hunger, Azadi from patriarchy, Azadi from homophobia, all of them important in their own right. But if we use that to challenge the very idea of struggle for political freedom, then it is essentially an alibi for nationalism, even couched in progressive terms. But I would argue that that's a failure of the notion of Azadi. Okay? So in that lecture, what I argued was Azadi at its very basis is an anti-colonial idea. When I say anti-colonial, it essentially implies challenges the hegemony and dominance of certain alien and alienating force. In case of Kashmir, what we find is the Indian rule and the Pakistani rule over Kashmir is alien rule. It's alien rule not because of international regulations or international resolutions. That's not important for me. UN resolution is secondary. It's important because for many Kashmiris, through the struggle, they have shown that specifically with India and occasionally with Pakistan, that they have a certain separate identity from India and Pakistan. And therefore, they should have the right to determine whether they want to be part of India, part of Pakistan, or be independent of both. Right? So that's the notion of Azadi I thought we should keep in mind. So economic, social, cultural freedom, but also political freedom. If we're not Kashmir, we are not those who are seen as colonized, who don't experience our identity being colonized. If we are talking of Azadi and we see Kashmiris talking of political freedom, if we could try to preach them that you should talk first about challenging patriarchy, challenging homophobia, challenging injustices, challenging capitalism, all of them are important in their own right, but it would still be very problematic and even paternalistic approach to Kashmiris, because then we are not very different from the more brutal right-wing fascists who don't even talk of other forms of Azadi, but they're very clear that that Kashmir should do what the Indians want them to do. In terms of democracy, the second term I used, democracy in the times of Hindutva or Hindu fascism. Now, democracy, broadly speaking, is about it's a political system, majority rule, minority rights, and right to dissent without fear. That's the majority rule, minority rights, and right to dissent without fear. There is no democracy in the world that's perfect. But we are talking of democracy as an idea, as a process, as an ideal for which people are struggling. People have given up life for democracy, we have to keep that in mind. And when we say democracy, we not only talk about the bourgeois form of democracy, a parliamentary form of democracy, or for that matter, this quasi-socialist form of democracy that exists in some parts of the world, but we are talking of an idea where people are at the heart of politics. Democracy at the very basis is about people. The people matter more than anything else. When we look at nationalism, nationalism is about certain collective over the people. So I would argue that nation-statism, so which combination or lethal combination of idea of nation and idea of state, what takes place there is, it goes against the very idea of democracy. Because democracy privileges people, both individual and collective. On the other hand, the idea of nation-statism privileges an imaginary idea of nation-state over people. The human beings have to be sacrificed and should be willing to sacrifice themselves. Human beings should be willing to be killed and kill others in the name of the nation-state. So what I'm saying therefore is that the very idea of nation-statism goes against the idea of democracy. But even in, let's say, reduced form, democracy would be majority rule, minority right, right to dissent without fear. Now majority rule is not about permanent majority or ethnic or religious majority. It's a political majority. Now we take example of what's happening today, and you know, in a sense, you are living through it. I'm not living through it directly, because at least I would say, I'm not living here, so I don't have to bear the brunt of what happens every day. But in your context, you have to live through it. Take the idea of majority. You see that, of course, the Hindu nationalism is a majoritarian system. Means it claims to speak in the name of the majority. Now we do say that, look, only 30% of people voted for them and 32%, but the reality is parliamentary democracy is like that. It's not an exception. It is, we have to accept that this is the most, let's say, organized force right now in this country. Now, they are attacking majority, but of course they are using majority rule as a tool. But when I did research with the Hindutva in the past, RSS, BHP and Bajrang Dal, I did not do research with BJP directly, because BJP is nothing but a friend for RSS. But when I did research with them, it was very clear that they saw BJP also as a tool for something else. Democracy as a tool for something else. Elections as a tool for something else. That something else was transforming the very place into a Hindu nation and making sure that Muslims and Christians, of course, are marginalized, if not expelled, broadly speaking, domesticated, and the Hindus themselves are domesticated because, of course, the marginalized caste Hindus, who are the majority, should start feeling that they are more in common with the upper caste than with the dominant caste rather than with the Muslims and Christians. That was part and parcel. So the project therefore was of transforming the very idea of India into something that is Hindu majoritarian. So Hindutva, at the very basis, is a majoritarian ideology. It's like what we find in AKP in Turkey. It's a very majoritarian ideology of certain form of Sunni, which is seen as Turkish. And Kurdish are not seen as that, Alawis are seen as suspect in that, and of course non-Muslims are seen as suspect in that. So we have this form of majority existing in different parts of the world, including South Asia, with Rohingya issue in terms of the Buddhist chauvinism in Burma, we have seen that. But in Indian context, what say that it's a majority rule for whom? And the saying, I recall, and this was saying that was told to me very frequently, many of you may have heard of it, Musalman ke Dohistan, Pakistani ya Kabristan. Now I remember being told of that many times, not in joke, but also sometimes in joke. And I did collect a lot of jokes what they had about it. And these are not, jokes are important to understand. It's about domestication. Now of course today, in official terms, when it's in public, RSS would say it's not anti-Muslim. BJP would say it's not anti-Muslim. They would say, oh, this is a contradiction, look at it. The idea is that all people living in India are Hindus. You could be Muslim, you could be Christian, you could be Hindu, but all of the people are Hindu. The Hindu is a largely geographical category. So far so good. But then you have got the same Hindutva panicking about imaginary increase in Muslim population. Now if RSS is true and honest and say that all people living in India, Hindus, Muslims, Christians and others are Hindus, then they should not matter whether you are Hindu or Muslim Hindu or Christian Hindu, because the population balance should not matter, and yet they panic. So this whole idea of seeing that Hindus are going to be outnumbered and therefore that's a serious threat to Hindu nation in India exposes the RSS idea and rhetoric that somehow they are about a pan-geographic idea of Hindu, which is essentially Indian. Because there is, I mean, and so in that context, Muslims and Christians have no place absolutely in Hindu imagination except as enemies. I said some are more honest, some are less honest, but that's what they have. So what happens is, of course, that the idea of majority rule becomes an idea of majoritarian rule. It's not democratic. Minority rights are largely de jure there, but de facto being eroded. And third, right to dissent without fear, of course, is also being eroded. So today, for instance, and I mean, you know that if you talk about not only Kashmir but other issues, we have to be slightly cautious. Many of you would be cautious. We should be cautious. Even people warn me, don't go to JNU, you'll have trouble. Not trouble from you, but I don't know who you are, but any trouble from you, but trouble from the goons, RSS, the nationalists, whatever term that is used. But what we find therefore that right to dissent without fear is being eroded. So there's a rapid erosion of minority rights and right to dissent without fear. Again, BJP has not come up with a policy that all Muslims have to expel, etc. It has not happened. But when we look at the de facto complete marginalization and disenfranchisement of Muslims from body politic, we see that's what has happened. So BJP has no, or rather except in PDP, with PDP in Kashmir that's an exception, but generally BJP hardly has any Muslim legislators who have been elected. Rajya Sabha is different. Not elected. So somehow, in the name of merit, they only find Hindus. Many upper caste Hindus, many non-upper caste Hindus. But the reality is that's what they're finding. And then they will say, oh, why should it matter whether it's Muslim, Christian or Hindu? The reality is, it could not be, it's not a coincidence that mostly it's the Muslims and Christians who are completely marginalized. Right? So what is happening? Therefore, marginalization of minorities. And we know this whole beef saga which is happening. The beef saga is nothing, it's not about, it's an attack on Dalits, it's an attack on tribals who have been eating beef, but largely it's an alibi for an attack on Muslims. It's not a coincidence that all the people so far who have been lynched and killed or almost killed happen to be Muslim. Because I said, cow, beef and everything is connected to the idea of Muslim and how to deal with it. And that's what we're facing. Now when we talk of, so that's what Hindutva is. And people have, scholars have, and scholars are quite, I would say, even I mean myself, scholars are very clever way of saying things but not saying much. Sometimes it's useful if you're living in a very authoritarian or totalitarian system, like Soviet Union was, or even China is, or South North Korea, there's a different kind of totalitarian system, or Saudi Arabia, for instance, you have to be clever in trying to question. But in kind of non-totalitarian, semi-authoritarian, democratic facade of countries like US, India and UK and other places, right? It's different, but even here, what happens is scholars, when they find, or the academics, when they find that the political space is shifting, they also start shifting. So it was not a coincidence that before Modi came to power, many who were criticizing Modi in the past, around 2002 when Gujarat riot, started softening the stance and used Supreme Court to say, oh well, the Supreme Court has cleared him, or even saying we have to move on. And that's not a coincidence because academics themselves are also sort of slaves to power. So they would talk of radical democracy, they may talk of radical ideas, they will talk of left politics, but they are deeply hierarchical. And I say example of deeply hierarchical, I can notice here itself in JNU, in various forums, and even Hyderabad I noticed, my example, at one time I was invited by Hyderabad faculty. In the past I went there. Recently I was also invited to give talk and I said no because I didn't have time. But students from there invited me and I went there. And apparently accepting invite of the student rather than invite of the faculty was somehow not done. Because somehow I challenged the hierarchy. But I had accepted because it was Kashmiri students inviting me and they were friends and I wanted to talk about Kashmir. Without mincing words, right? Now, what happened is, but I could sense the hierarchy and suddenly being sort of seen as a problematic person. And I know that it exists. Here also I've noticed in body politics and make a body gesture of academics and students, the way in which you have to always say sir, ma'am and mean it. If you don't mean it, then it's a problem. Then you also have if things are organized by the teacher, it can go on and on. If it's organized by student, it can also go on, but not when it's together. And all those hierarchies exist. Now the reason I mention this is because fascism does not come out of nowhere. It comes out of us. So in a sense, we are, our families are, we could be potential fascists. And remember that a lot of neocons in US, some of them were seen as on the left in the past. There was this entire group in Europe that was on the far left. They were so far left that they started attacking unions for being compromising. They started attacking socialists for being compromising, and they ended up being right-wing. And this whole Institute of Ideas in UK context, which talks of neoliberal ideas and capitalism as a solution to the world. And they were the far left in the past. And so they're so much into libertarianism and liberalism that they become right from while they consider the left. So I'm just giving these examples to remind ourselves, therefore, that when you talk of fascism, it comes from us. It comes from all of us in that context, not someone else practicing it, us practicing it, right? The idea then is, when Hindutva Fascism, and I will not even explain why Hindutva is fascism. If you have doubt, please ask question later, I can expand that to you. But broadly, fascism is about complete non-tolerance. It is about using democratic form to remove democracy. We saw with the Nazis, right? They came to power using democracy and then of course remove democracy. That's what they do. So saying that somehow BJP is elected by the people and we should respect democracy. Now in the West, in the UK, I remember this was the argument used by many that now that Modi has won, it's a democratic mandate, and if you criticize him, then we are going against the idea of democracy. Though the way I would see it, the very idea of democracy that we have to hold those who are in power accountable. So we're not saying that Modi should be removed, that's what I would want, but we are not saying that he should be removed. But we're saying is part of democracy is challenging those who rule, especially those who rule who have got bloods on the hand and who are leading politics that are going to subvert democracy. Right? That's, and I know it's a bit long background, but then background to the whole concept of Azadi is anti-colonial, and my argument, and I can expand that again for you who were not in the past, but I've said that many times, Kashmir is a colony of India in that context, it's a colonized space. So Azadi is an anti-colonial idea, broadly environment in India of the Hindutva fascism and the subversion of democracy. That does not mean that democracy was ideal in the past, but it does mean that in sense Hindu national fascism is taking it more rapidly in a direction which was not contemplated even 50 years ago. When it comes to Kashmir, of course, there's a commonality between secular nationalists and Hindu nationalists. There's a commonality between the far right and the, not far left, but far right and even the left. And there's a commonality between the reactionary nationalists and the progressive nationalists. The commonality is claiming that Kashmir is an integral part of India. Now, and I've said that again, I'll repeat, the integral part essentially implies that it's not only part of India, but without that India cannot exist. And yesterday I was talking at Ashoka University along slightly different line, but the fact that, and you know, the Bharat Mata thing, you talk of it, the notion is that Kashmir is a crown. So Jammu and Kashmir is the crown of India. So India cannot exist without Jammu and Kashmir. On August 1947, when India was formed, India existed without Jammu and Kashmir. So we are talking for Bharat Mata without her head, and she did survive for weeks without having, you know, IV and other things being included in it. So what I'm trying to argue is that if really India could not exist without Jammu and Kashmir, India would have collapsed on 15th of August 1947. Same idea is with Pakistan. Pakistan claiming that Kashmir is jugular vein of Pakistan, but if, as you can imagine, if someone's jugular vein is being held, you can't survive for 70 years without it. So all this language of bodily part and everything sounds interesting to sort of make people emotional and see how can you actually go against, you know, cutting your own body. The reality is, of course, that body parts can be cut and people can survive. Of course, not your head. But in that context, of course, Kashmir being declared or seen as the crown of India, crown and also the head of India, makes it more difficult to challenge it. But one easy example, and always we can say with anyone who says Kashmir is an integral part, India can't survive it. Well, how did India survive then from 15th August 1947 onwards till India, of course, through problematic means included Kashmir, or it was occupied Kashmir and claimed it's legal. That's one argument there, right? So we can see there's a problematic argument which has been made over time. Now, so colony is there. Now, what we find with Kashmir is, of course, the integral part that is common. Or second, the idea that yes, the difference is the right wing say, good, all Kashmir should be killed, and they do say it, by the way, if not in public. Now they might say it in public, but in private, just talk to them. They said all Kashmir should be killed, all Muslims should be killed, everyone should be killed. Everyone, possibly 90% of you would also be killed, and of course I will be killed too. Right? So, okay, as an aside, and I do an often aside thing. So whenever I have criticized Hindutva or talked of Kashmir, one common argument used against me that, oh, but you don't live in India. How would you? Things have changed. You don't know the ground reality. And most people who criticize me online using this argument that I don't live in India, therefore I don't know about India, have never lived in India. They're in California, Silicon Valley, London. So I'm talking of certain form of Hindu right way, who have not lived here, but of course are more Indian than most of you. So now, where was it? Yes, the Hindutva. So what we find is that there's integral part argument used, and the second part, of course, is that for Hindu right, essentially Kashmir has to be part because we cannot give up, and it's part of Pakistan's proxy war. But that's not the reality. The proxy war argument is largely used by Congress form of secular nationalism, who don't blame Muslims openly, they blame Pakistan. It is Hindu nationalists who are, in a sense, don't blame Pakistan, they blame Muslims. And that is a slight difference between them, where Congress would say that, oh, Muslims per se are not a problem, but I'm talking the public rhetoric, by the way. Muslim per se not a problem, it is Pakistan that's a problem. And the Hindu nationalists say Pakistan is a problem because it's Muslim, but essentially Muslims who are a problem, including Kashmiri Muslims. Now, Indian Muslims may not express solidarity with Kashmiri Muslims thinking it's a different issue or they don't want it because they'll be anti-India and all of that is there. But for the Hindu nationalists, there's absolutely no difference between Javed Akhtar or someone else fighting Hizbul Mujahideen person in Kashmir, because all of them are seen as the Muslim. The Muslim is not the real Muslims, but the Muslim is the stereotype of Muslims as a threat to Hindu body politic and to India. They would argue that. Now, for secular nationalists in India, of course, the idea is you need Kashmir because without Kashmir, India cannot be secular. Well, then the idea that Indian secularism is so weak that you do need a Muslim majority state to be part of it, whether they want to be part of it or not. It reminds me of Tibet, where Tibet became an integral part of China, and of course the language used by the Communist Party, and communists, when they are imperialists, are more clever and draconian than anyone else sometimes. They can be more clever and sly, and they use the word liberation. So the idea is they liberated Tibet, and of course they liberated Tibet from whom? From Tibetans themselves. And from foreign imperialists, except there were only 4 British officials in Tibet in 1951 when Tibet was supposedly liberated. So in secular nationalist context of the Congress kind, or even to an extent the mainstream left political parties kind, the idea is that Kashmir should be part of India because without that Indian secularism would be a problem, and if they're not part of it, then what would happen to Indian Muslims? Again, so the rhetoric is that our secularism is very fragile. So we need to keep occupying a territory and a people who may not want to be part of us because without that our legitimacy is questioned. And for more progressive nationalists, as a nationalist, they would come up with the argument, and some of them very well intentioned, that of course there's human rights abuses in Kashmir, there's rape in Kashmir, there's torture in Kashmir, there's killing in Kashmir, military is not a force for good, but India is a country that does not enslave anyone. Now India is a country that does not enslave anyone. Well, go and ask Kashmiris, but more and more Kashmiris, do they feel enslaved? Keep in mind the slavery, there were more brutal form of slavery, more obvious kind of slavery, and then the non-obvious form of slavery. Most people who are racist do not admit they're racist. They'll always say, oh, I'm not racist, but, or they will say, oh, I have a black friend, but, or most people who are homophobic, they say, I have a gay best friend, but, right? That's a very common rhetoric. So in this context, the progressive nationalist position, I would say progressive, not all of us, would be that if they argue that yes, what India has done in Kashmir is not right, human rights abuses, but India has not enslaved anyone, then the onus is on them to explain that if what has happened in Kashmir and other places, by the way, I'm talking Kashmir as an example, if what has happened in Kashmir is not form of colonization, form of slavery, because we're not talking the old form of slavery, we're talking the colonial form of slavery. If that is not colonialism, then what is colonialism? What is it? Right? So in this sense, the onus is on those who believe in the idea of India and believe in the integrity of India as it exists today, to therefore make sure that justice is provided to Kashmir under the Indian Constitution first. And I would argue that it's very difficult to provide, well, it's not possible to provide right to self-determination under Indian Constitution. But most of the issues of justice, human rights, has to be and could be provided with the Indian Constitution. So there's a favorite strategy, a political move made by Indian nationalists that, oh well, everything should be under the Constitution. And therefore, if you're saying no, Constitution does not provide right to self-determination, then the onus is somehow upon you and by declaring it to be anti-national. The rhetoric or the politics should be other way around. So ethical position would be, well, if I believe that Kashmir is an integral part of India, then the onus is on me to make sure that under the constitution, every right is provided first. It's provided for many years, and then I would say, well, they still need the right to self-determination? If yes, please have it. Because the form of democracy we are talking of, not the democracy which exists today, as it includes right to self-determination. Without right to self-determination, without a very robust idea of Azadi that includes political freedom, the democracy is essentially a for democracy or a limited democracy. Now in Kashmir context, as I'm assuming most of you would know, the form of rule that India has exercised is very clearly in terms of, starting with today, some of you may have read, many may not have read, I don't know, let me repeat. There was a story about the story. Of course, you could say allegation, we can't say it for sure, but there was a question of a Kashmiri girl, a young Kashmiri girl, being assaulted by, and the term that was used molested, but it was assaulted by a military person. She shouted, people got involved, and they caught the person, tried to take him to the police, the military came there, and then what happened was, of course, people protested. Now you say, we have protested to make sure that the army person does not escape. And what happened was live bullet fire, and 2 people were killed. And the army has said that it was unfortunate, it will look into it, and make sure it does not happen. Now, of course, the point is, you can see that in Kashmir context, whatever happened, even if army somehow acknowledges that the guy or the military person who was involved in assaulting did assault, or that they may be court-martialed. I'm saying they may be. It's an extreme case. It could be. Right? If they're very low person and are low in terms of low in hierarchy, it's possible that they could be court-martialed. But most of them we are not going to find out. But court-martials are often held in secret. Or sometimes we may be found. But that's court-martial. Now, will they be allowed to go to civilian courts? Not at all. Because AFSPA prevents military and military persons and, not the military, even police, if they join the operation with the military from being under scrutiny civilian. Sometimes what you find in Kashmir is the JK police is involved in certain kind of operation which involves a lot of killing. What they would is they invite the military to join them. They invite the military to join them because if military is there, even notionally, then JK police also is covered under AFSPA. It's that kind of thing. So under rule of law, a girl was assaulted and she is going to go and the person is going to get unpunished possibly. The 2 people have been killed. And there's going to be more protests tomorrow and more people are likely to get killed. That is part and parcel of Indian democracy in Kashmir. Occasionally before elections we had in certain contexts encounter killing, yes, encounter killing sounds so odd, but extrajudicial killing, certain punishments given. But that will be less than 0.01% of what has happened. What happened in 1990s, there is no justice for it. Kunan Pushpa is a well-known case of mass rape. There's no justice. And not only there's no justice, there's no even efforts to provide justice. You've got cases of enforced disappearance. I said 8 to 10,000. They're the victims, and of course their families, so between 50 to 80 to 100,000 people are victims, because when I'm disappeared, then the person who's close to me, my family gets victimized overall. So all of us become victims, right? So the idea that has happened, and yet there is no justice for them, and it looks unlikely that they will provide justice. Now, when we talk of enforced disappearance, we are talking of people where there is documentation of certain kind of who has taken them. So we are not talking of people who could have just ran away somewhere. Many Kashmiris did run away to the other side, right? To then come back to fight. We are not talking them. We are talking people who are taken away, and there is some proof of police or paramilitary or military saying that yes, we took him there. He must be in that hospital. And you go to the hospital and you never found. You don't find. So imagine the struggle in 1990s for Kashmir, especially for women mothers, because fathers would usually not go out because they would be under more threat of being killed. Women would go out, try to run from pillar to post, and still looking for their sons. That is. So when we say India is a country that has not enslaved any, I think then we have to justify that what is enforced disappearance, what is torture, what is mass killing, what is mass rape, what is use of sexual violence, what is use of torture, all of that. So in that we have to look into that. So broadly, coming back to the point of self-determination, I mean, there can be no hope for Azadi and democracy in India with Hindutva fascism. That's very clear. That they go against they militate against the very idea of democracy and Azadi. But there can be no struggle, a genuine struggle for Azadi and democracy in India of all forms, and we talk a rich notion of economic peace, justice, social justice, political justice, right to live with dignity and everything. There can be no this without also solidarity in India with people who are fighting for or struggling for freedom from India. That could include Kashmir, that could also include non-Kashmir, it could include Naga, it could include more people in the past, in the future. Because stating that we are firstly and lastly Indian, and that was the poster I saw with NSUI somewhere there. We are firstly Indian and lastly Indian, something like that. Very awkward language. But anyway, firstly and lastly Indian. I don't know what it means. I don't think when you're born, it's said we are Indian, and when we're dead, we say Indian, right? But anyway, that's it. I thought we are born human, we die human, and then we take other forms of identity. But firstly and lastly, we're Indian. That form of national could be it could be justified if that national is not used to then say, if you don't feel you're Indian, then you have to be brutalized and dehumanized. Right? If I say, well, I feel Indian and I want to be Indian, that's fine. But if you also have to be Indian and you can only be in the form that I say you should be Indian, then that becomes a fascistic notion of nationalism. If I say I'm Indian, I want to say Bharat Mata Ki Jai, fine, I could say Bharat Mata Ki Jai, I could say, no, I don't know, something else. But the point is, you also have to say Bharat Mata Ki Jai. If you, Bharat Mata Ki Jai, you don't say, then somehow you are anti-national. These forms of intolerance in that sense are militant against the idea of democracy and Azadi. But even within progressive nationalism, if we insist upon Kashmir is an integral part of India, and we don't do much to make sure that first and foremost we express solidarity with Kashmir who suffered in the Indian occupation and help them in right to self-determination. And then say, well, we have helped you, can you give us Azadi now? Because maybe India needs Kashmir, because through Kashmiri self-determination, maybe Indians will get some form of self-determination. Then you will sort of appeal to the Kashmir that now we have helped you get your self-determination. Can you help us also? You got Azadi with our solidarity, we now give us solidarity to get Azadi from the kind of systems we have. Right? That's long term. But with progressive nationalism, it's very clear that even with them, that there can be no Azadi and there can be no hope for genuine democracy in India until and unless there's a recognition also on the parts of the progressive nationalists, progressive left, that in the end, Kashmir and others, but Kashmir have right to self-determination, which means they have the right to have Azadi. Now, Azadi, you could say, what does it mean? Does it mean necessarily separation from India? Not really. It could mean, as someone said, it could be freedom within India, freedom from India, freedom outside India, and anywhere else. But essentially it implies it's the right of Kashmiris to decide, as people, when I say Kashmir, I mean inhabitants of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, including Kashmiri Pandits who have been in exile and all of them, right? It's a right for them to decide once and for all whether they want to be part of India, part of Pakistan, part of China, part of anything else. That's the basic right. And for me, I don't understand why it's seen as such a problematic issue. Now, it can only be seen as a problematic issue if we recognize that Indian state is such a fragile state that if somehow Kashmiris get Azadi, then India is going to collapse. So the whole threat of balkanization. Now, if a state needs to brutalize, colonize and dehumanize millions of people in order to justify survival, then I think that state does not have the right to exist. A state can only have the right to exist if it serves the people. And if people means all the people. That's the very basis of democracy. Otherwise we are talking of fascism. And remember, fascism is a form of nationalism. All nationalism can turn into fascism. It's an extreme form of nationalism. Fascism is not religious. It could be sacralization of nationalism, but fascism is essentially nationalism, nation-statism, where you have a certain form of nationalism, majoritarian, certain form of state, they're coming together, occupying each other, controlling each other, and inducing violence and dehumanization at large scale. So in Indian context, what I see that I don't see why, for instance, this whole idea of self-determination of Kashmiris, or them having the right to have right to have Azadi and everything, struggle for Azadi, is such a big issue. Because India is supposed to be a democracy. The idea of India was supposed to be about for people. Why did we go and remove the British? We did not remove them because they were inefficient. We did not remove them because they were, we removed them. When I say we, I mean not we. I say we for everyone, by the way. But when we say we, We mean that removed is because they're seen as alien, they're seen as colonizer, and essentially they're seen as rulers under whom it's not possible for Indians to live with dignity. Going back to Kashmir, you could see with everyday politics in Kashmir, specifically in Kashmir Valley, it's very difficult, or at least for many Kashmiris, quite difficult for them to live under occupation of India with dignity. And therefore, right to self-determination and Azadi essentially about right to freedom and right to live with dignity as equal human beings. Equality is not against freedom. Dignity is not against freedom. Rich notion for Azadi, including everyone else. Right? And therefore, I would conclude, but what I would sum up, Hindutva Fascism is enemy of all human beings, those who see themselves first and foremost human beings. That's very clear. Only if you start seeing yourself as essentially nationalist, essentially certain form of Hindu, then you think that human beings are the problem and Hindu ideology is the right ideology. But on Kashmir, and Kashmir is a more important, a fundamental question of how come there's a similarity between the right-wing Hindu nationalism, the secular mainstream secular nationalism, and also the so-called progressive left nationalism. What is the commonality? That commonality is a belief, and almost an unquestioned belief in the idea and imaginary idea of nation-state of India. An imaginary idea of nation-state of India where, you know, even though your map that you follow, in the map you draw, the map that children draw in the childhood is a fictitious map because the north part does not belong to India, or rather it's not controlled by India at the very least. It's controlled by Pakistan, controlled by China. So this is the fiction that nationalism generates. And any progressive idea, including progressive left idea, is one that has to privilege humanity over anything else. And I am the one who does not believe essentially that I see myself as left in various ways, but I don't identify any longer with the idea of communism as it has been practiced in various parts of the world. I like the idea of communism to an extent, but not the way it has been practiced. Because what we find is that in some forms of communism also, the way it was practiced, the idea of state was fetishized. Rather than disappearance of the state that was supposed to be the ultimate goal, what we find is fetishization of state. So in that context, what we find even in India, many Marxists, many left have adopted a more Stalinist idea of building socialism in one country. Not that socialism is built in any country here, but that's the idea that follows, rather than more Marxist or even Leninist idea which accepted the idea of self-determination. So, and that's my last sentence. It's very important that we understand the struggle for freedom in Kashmir is a struggle for freedom which the Kashmiris have to decide what they want, whether to be part of India, not to be part of India, part of Pakistan and everything. And the struggle for Indians is to decide and to determine what form of country they want, a form of country that's colonizing, brutal and dehumanizing, or a form of country that actually provides genuine dignity and equality and freedom to all. Thank you very much.
वहाँ पे कुनान पोशपोरा के बारे में जब भी सोचते हैं तो मतलब रोंगटे खड़े होने से ज़्यादा एक बार गला भर आता है कि क्या मतलब ये हम इसी पार्ट में और हमारे हिंदुस्तान का ही एक हिस्सा जो वैसा हिस्सा नहीं, अखंड हिस्सा नहीं, मतलब जुड़ा हुआ, वहाँ पे ये चल रहा है। वहाँ औरतें, बच्चे और वहाँ के नौजवान क्या झेल रहे हैं, उन सबको देखते हुए इसके समाधान की, जब हम समझ रहे हैं समस्या को, तो कहीं ना कहीं से समाधान के बारे में भी हमें सोचना चाहिए। और एक बार फिर से मैं दिवेश से वही पूछूंगी, कैसे?
The way I will answer this is, and there was another question you asked last time, which I had no answer to, by the way, that how do we organize? Like the idea is, it's okay, you want to talk, it's an important thing, but how do we organize? And I'd say very frankly, I really don't know. And I would still repeat the idea that I don't know how to organize. So that's my, I will not pretend that I have some idea, because maybe you have more, or you have more idea how to organize, how to work in group, I don't. So that's why I will not even answer, or try to begin to answer how to organize. But the broad question of the solution part is, there was a similar question yesterday at Ashoka University where someone asked me that we know what's happening, it's very bad, but just tell us, look at what is happening in JNU, Hyderabad University. It's so dangerous for us to speak, what should we do? And those are also very genuine concerns. We can't simply say, oh, just go brave and just go, not brave, bravery, let me take back the word of bravery. Bravery is not what I'm talking about. It's a lot of us have different limitations. We have family limitation, we have health limitation, where sometimes we have to go silent. At the very least, I would say that we start by thinking, and thinking is important. Now those of us who already think or we're thinking about this issue assume that everyone would understand. But 99% of people in India still don't know about Kashmir in this form. Now what of course this saga of JNU has done, or saga of Hindutva attack on JNU has done is, it has popularized the bigotry against Kashmir amongst the population in Kashmir, in Delhi. Against Kashmir and of course against JNU. That's what the government did. In 1990s, when I was growing up, most of us, we did not even know what's happening in Kashmir, and there was no prejudice as such in popular imagination against Kashmir. Simply we did not know. And sometimes I think ignorance is slightly better than this kind of bigotry, because more or less this kind of knowledge that somehow it's a dangerous, seditious place and Kashmir, thankless people who take our taxes and come over here, completely ignoring the fact that the economy of Jammu and Kashmir was not dependent on what is India today. It was dependent, or rather it was part and parcel of a zone that included Central Asia, that included the region that became Pakistan. It was India that made it dependent on it. It is India that colonized it, and that is colonization making the country dependent on it. That's what happened. Now, in context, I do think thinking is still important. Second is also, in terms of thinking around, thinking aloud with our own family. I do think that a lot. I use the word think a lot, I'm very sorry. But I do think that it's very important that we start speaking around us. University spaces are still one way we could talk, but go back to the family, speak to people in the family, you realize that most of them don't agree with you. But how to engage with them at the second level of challenge, how to engage with other students at the third level of challenge, how to confront but also try to make sense to the other in the university, fourth kind of challenge. The media discourse is dominated, but the other forms of media, including social media, where we could try to use and give alternative perspectives. I'm someone who does not believe in complete disengagement from the mainstream. So my idea is, let's use the mainstream and try to challenge it. Sometimes we won't be successful, but let's say the colonized and the oppressed and those fighting against the very strong form of fascistic and nationalistic dominance, we don't have the luxury of not engaging with them. So we have to engage with them, and something, even what you're doing, it is important. I know it's easier for you not to do it. Something could have gone wrong and you'd be in trouble. These things have happened. We saw what happened on 9. And again, interesting part is that what happened on 9 was not anything unique. It has been happening since 2013. It was even smaller scale than the past. But this was a very effective discourse, effective, let's say, manufactured saga to not only distract people from Hyderabad, which is challenging BJP politically, and using the Kashmir issue, where even the progressive nationalists first have to say we are nationalists and then we are progressive. So that was huge. But broadly we are thinking, okay, but also speaking to various public. And in my own reading, and when I've spoken in various parts of the country, let's say in university of course mostly, I've found that many people, Indians I'm talking about, have not gone to say, oh, it's good that Kashmir is being raped, it's good that Kashmiris are being killed or tortured. And there will be a question that's not happening. At most they will question, what about Pandits, what about others? Do you think if Kashmir becomes a nation state, that's a legitimate question, Kashmir becomes a nation state, how is it going to be guaranteed that it's going to be better than what Indian state is, given that Indian state is not much better than British state? And again, the right response there is, but that's for Kashmir to decide. If they don't, that's their failure. And Kashmiri movement has had, and I mentioned even Mahmood Bhatt last time, Kashmiri movement has had leaders in the past and hopefully in the future, not many in the present by the way, at least in my reading, we have had leaders in the past like Mahmood Bhatt who had talked of Azadi in various forms, including political freedom but also economic, social and cultural freedom. And that's what we need.
Now the floor is open, आप लोगों को जिस
Then our constitution says by the articles like, if any, like this saying if they are funded 100% by the government, this can't be a minority institution. But the constitution says government will not discriminate to fund on the basis of minority institutions. But government, like the BJP, argues that minority institutions should be abolished. And I want to comment.
And again, in terms of this, I'm not going to the specificity of it because I've followed it but not followed into the law and rule and regulation as you're pointing out. But as it's very clear, it is a political movement. There is no intellectual justification. There is no funding related justification. Government has a lot of funding. Government is a very rich government. Indian state is a huge, it's not for health and education and other things, but it's very much for the military and even part of the security industry. But what's happening, of course, is they're targeting minority institutions because through that they want to reach the ideal situation, which according to them is, of course, minorities should not be recognized as minorities. Minorities should be recognized supposedly Indians, right? That's on the legal battlefront. But the challenge they face, of course, is, or rather not challenge, the ethos of Hindu nationalism is very clear that in the end, no Muslim can be trusted. I recall a conversation, not only various conversations with the RSS guys in Ayodhya in 2004 and 5, when I would say, but what about Muslims who are seen as nationalists? And they say, no, there is no one who's nationalist. So I said, what about that, who was the president? That guy who was more Hindu than the Hindus? Nuclear guy. कौन था आपका president? Kalam, sorry. He was the president then. I remember asking, what about Kalam? ये कौन है? ये तो मतलब आपके ही हैं, ठीक है? Said नहीं 100 साल दो, फिर हमें पता चलेगा ये असली में हमारे हैं या नहीं. And then he said, how do you know? इनके आँखों में देखो. I'm using this. आँखों में देखिए, आपको दिखेगा. You can never trust them. They would always use this analogy of that Muslims are someone who can never be trusted. And that is at the heart of Hindu nationalist ideology. And of course, that is the Hindu nationalist ideology that's being implemented in the past subtly, now even more blatantly, and they're doing it through these means by talking of removing minority institutions, they get government funded. This is part of the politics, and that's what's happening.
I see two parts. One is the moral argument that we put forward, like the proposals that we have at our disposal. And then there is the other part of institutional feasibility as a part of solution. So when we talk of it, in particular reference of Kashmir, the moral argument, like whenever we have talks like right to self-determination or any other talk on Kashmir or on issues similar to Kashmir, we have always people talking about this moral justification of the right to self-determination law. But the idea of institutional feasibility, like the nationalist perspective, that it's not institutionally feasible if you talk about plebiscite or some other means of right to self-determination, etc., etc. So how do we respond to this kind of a problem, which is being posed to us by this many people who are at the current affairs? So this idea of institutional feasibility, and particularly the problem is not like the nationalist perspective per se. There is a problem there, but the problem is in these talks which we have on this kind of issue, because we are always morally justifying all these political issues and how our right to self-determination right and this, but way ahead, how is our right to self-determination or our whole movement is going to be institutionalized in the current political context. That's not there. And how do you look at this issue? Because we also see in these talks, we completely ignore this completely exclusionary movements which are very much confined within the valley. Because the very idea of freedom of Kashmir as a right to self-determination, including this word, particular word Kashmir, because I feel it like when we come out of Kashmir, people from Jammu region, people from Ladakh, anybody coming from this whole state, we are like in India, everybody will say that, oh, you are Kashmiri, but within Kashmir, this is not. The language is not same. So the very definition of Kashmiri within this particular region, within the conflict region, and the movements which are there boasting of like the movement that they are carrying forward, right to self-determination and all that we are doing, but their confinement within that particular valley, and then the response to this problem of institutional feasibility from the nationalist perspective. How do you see these two problems?
Thank you very much. Now the reason a lot of time, people like me use the the moral argument is because right now even that has to be made with that also does not exist 99%, right? For those of us who are into it, we know it already. But a lot of times we have to make that argument because in a sense we have to use the ideals that the states have or the people have to justify us, argue that this is the idea you have, democracy, right? Nationalist movement of India was about democracy and everything, never about the statement about democracy. So the idea is you use that to then challenge that you're not practicing what you're supposed to practice. So that was the reason why we use moral. The institutional part and the second exclusionary movement. Institutional part was very clear. Any decolonization, it's not abrupt decolonization. When we take examples of freedom movement in other parts of the world, when you look at the decolonization, it takes over a period of time. Then negotiations. Take example of India, the way in which India was negotiated, you had partition as part and parcel of the institution building. End of British rule did not imply that the state collapsed. All it meant was, of course, the successor state, India was a success, it took over. The bureaucracy continued, the military continued. The military that was essentially a slave of the British, and they were slaves of the British, become, now they, not slave, but they become part and parcel of the Indian nation state. So what happened, I was saying that institutions continue, banking systems continue. That happens in most parts of the world. It's very rare, for instance, after freedom movement, that the colonizer somehow withdraws everything, or rather said, now you had the bank crushing it down. It will only happen when you have a major kind of war between the colonized and the colonizer completely removed. So there is institutional thing there. Now feasibility part, if we take example of the region itself, Bhutan. In fact, my colleague Natasha Kaul, she had argued that earlier in 2010, that if Bhutan would have first quasi-independence, independence and sovereignty, so can Kashmir. Bhutan's population is less than 1 million. Kashmir is much bigger population. So Bhutan could do it, and it was also sandwiched between two major huge draconian colonial states, India and China. Now of course, the way it did was by siding with India. And over time it gained full sovereignty. But notionally it was there. The reality is small states, unless they are like Switzerland and very powerful, they do have to negotiate with neighbors. It will be very difficult for Jammu and Kashmir, an independent state, to survive if there is hostility with India, hostility with Pakistan, hostility with China. It would not survive. That's the reality. In fact, the only way in which it will survive is there is some kind of accommodation with all three, that they respect the independence of Jammu and Kashmir. Is that feasible? That's very much feasible. In realm of practical. Where it would happen, it's unlikely. It's unlikely because China would not allow an independent state in the region, simply because an independent Jammu and Kashmir implies we have got more movement in Tibet and in Xinjiang. Pakistan also would not allow it, because then it also implies significant Balochistan, and India of course will not. So those are practical problems. Institutionally and feasibility-wise, economically, historically, Kashmir was a meeting point for Central Asia, West Asia, Tibet and even South Asia. So there is no reason why it cannot happen in one situation. Now in terms of the movement, as I said, realistically, for that, India and Pakistan primarily have to be more mature when the privileged Kashmir is first and foremost, and then let them decide and see what happens. Regarding the exclusion movement, I'm not denying. I'm not saying that Kashmiri nationalist movement is somehow the most progressive and inclusive movement that has included everyone. Now, I've not studied the Kashmiri nationalist movement, so I may be a bit wrong, so I don't usually comment on them. But in my own reading, which could be partial reading or misreading, so I would agree with you that there are exclusion movements. There's certain form of superiority where Kashmiri is seen as a Kashmiri identity seen as superior to the Gujar, superior to the Jammu and superior to the Dogon, everyone else. So there's that aspect which makes, sadly, Kashmiri nationalist movement not that different from other nationalist movement in South Asia. Right? Sometimes you wonder that Kashmiri, if they want Azadi, maybe they should really seek Azadi from this kind of discourse that dominates South Asia, of hatred and bigotry. That is there. You've got all forms of movement, but you have to understand that nationalist movements are not unidimensional, they're dynamic, they're evolving. And right to self-determination is, we have to work for Jammu and Kashmir, because that's what is under international law. It is Jammu and Kashmir in its entirety that is disputed territory. But even within that, for instance, if the significant parts of the Jammu and Kashmir that don't feel part of Jammu and Kashmir, then even they would have right to self-determination. As a basic principle, that has to be there. Now, it is a failure of Kashmiri nationalist movement to reach out to others, but partly it's their failure, but it's partly the mechanism of the state. They are dealing with, and Kashmiri nationalist movement has been dealing with the two most sly states in the region, India and Pakistan both. Using religion, using non-religion, using secularism, using democracy, using militarism, using all forms of isms, try to make sure that this remains a dispute between India and Pakistan, and Kashmir, even when you talk of Kashmir as people, remain second. So I would say therefore there are problems, and that's what Kashmir to work out. And even for those of us who may have solidarity, to point out if we can, but so I'm not saying that it's a perfect, but that's a movement that's evolving.
Then question, and the question is regarding the accession of Kashmir to India, right? What the general line of argument says is that some tribesmen came to Kashmir and they started, destroying the property and everything. So in return, in reaction, the Maharaja has to accede, asking for help to India for all that. But there is another line of argument which says that before the partition or before the accession, that like October 1947, I mean, there was a hell lot of atrocities committed by the Maharaja on the Muslims in the Jammu province, right? I mean, if you see the figures from March 1947 to August 1947, I mean, a lot of the newspaper in London, I mean, it used to write that more than 250,000 Muslims in Jammu regions were killed actually, assassinated by the Maharaja. So, the Kashmir that is with the Pakistan right now is not actually the Kashmir from the valley, but the Kashmir which is actually a part of Jammu. I mean, the Pir Panjal area, the area from Mirpur, right, the Rajouri and Poonch and all that. And this was the area where the brutality and the atrocity by the Maharaja's army was highest, right? And the people actually had to flee from this area to Pakistan to get assistance, arm and whatsoever the rebellion and all that. And they came back, right, to fight the Maharaja's army. And this is how it started, right? So it was not, the mainstream Indian authors or, they try to blame that it was actually the tribesmen who actually initiated it first. But it was actually, the people within Kashmir, actually, within the valley who actually started it first, right? So I want your clarification on it, that it was not actually the Maharaja who acceded India to save the people of Kashmir, but to save his own dynasty from the rebellions. So first is the clarification on it. The second is about the exodus of Kashmiri Pandits, because the mainstream authors write that it is actually because the wave of Islamization in valley which actually pushed the Kashmiris out of it. While if we see another line of argument which says that it was not like that actually. The wave of RSS interventions and all that actually, the role of RSS, and because the way Jagmohan was reappointed, right, like 10 days before the exodus happened, right? So, your clarification on that point of view also. And third more question, I don't know, I'm since my childhood I have been, listening that India is an integral part of India. That Kashmir is an integral part of India. I went through all the arguments and everything, and I couldn't find a single reasonable answer that why India believes that Kashmir is an integral part of India.
Thanks a lot for these three questions, comments. But the first one is more clarification that you have already provided, so I don't think I can add much to it. There's a very good work by Christopher Snedden, for instance, in recent times. Christopher Snedden, it's understanding Kashmir or something, but it's the untold history of Kashmir. So again, the notion of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir was waiting and making a decision whether they want to join India or Pakistan, and then the Qabilis came in, and of course they raped nuns and they killed people, and Kashmiri Maharaja decided to join India, and of course National Conference, which was a party in the valley, important party, also decided that they would prefer India over Pakistan, right? So those are kind of narrative. That they ignore the fact that of the violence by the Maharaja even before that. And of course they also ignore the fact that in 1930s onwards you already started a movement against Maharaja in Kashmir, and even in 1860s and 70s you had protests against Maharajas that could be seen as sort of proto-nationalistic background to what's happening today. So that's part and parcel of it. See, regarding the invasion, Qabili invasion, everything, all movements of these kinds are more complicated. It's never about one or the other factor only. And of course there's external factor, there's internal factor. Both of them are involved. In that context, what I found is both India and Pakistan were impatient. They were impatient to try to get Maharashtra to decide in their favor. And you could think, why would Maharaja decide in favor of Pakistan? Well, one of the arguments used was that because it was more likely that they could preserve the privilege in Pakistan than in India. Because in India, literally, there was this notion that with Nehru and others, there could be some form of socialism and everything that would go against the Maharaja, right? So there were these kind of things. Then, of course, what the two states did was they tried to encourage and they scavenged upon and they used the protests that were already taking place. And this is what had happened even in 1990s. You do have an indigenous Kashmiri movement taking up arms against India. Then you also have Pakistan using indigenous movement or even encouraging, supporting is there, but also using. So it's both. Then using one, then against the other, so-called JKLF, then there's Mujahideen, and then both against each other. And then of course the India which also used then the militants, the Ikhwani, against the Kashmir. So what you have is both states encouraging, using, fighting against each other, because that's what they're good at, and that's what allows the large-scale as well as cottage industry of violence to continue in Jammu and Kashmir. That's why they do it, right? There's what was the second question? Second.
The exodus of
Exactly. Now with Pandit thing now, it's a complicated issue. Sadly, no proper research has been done on the issue of what happened at that point in time.
There are statements by a lot of authenticated authors regarding these models.
No, there are, but I'm saying, but there's no proper research which actually should be easy to do, which is you go and look at the narratives of the people, ethnography of the people, and you do. But there's no proper academic research I'm talking. No, writers or authors saying about their own experience is fine. I mean, it's very important, but there is no research in terms of what happened, why it happened, and everything. Now, the way I would see it, there's always this whole notion of course, what about Pandit issue that's being raised specifically since 2008. And the timeline of what about Pandit issue is interesting because in 1990s, what about Pandit was not a rhetoric used against to justify violence by Indian state against Kashmiri Muslims. Even in 2002, 2004, what about Pandit was not used to justify brutalization of Kashmiri Muslims. It's only when, since 2008, when Kashmiris use media, they use democratic means, and they also use things like stone pelting to challenge the Indian narrative, and Indian narrative gets punctured is when the what about Pandit issues brought about to say, but what about them? But in such ridiculous manner where people are asked, what about Pandits? Why did you not speak about Pandit even when they were not born when Pandit issue, when Pandit exodus took place? But the way I have not done research, but I have come across people who did experience fear and who did live in fear. For someone, for more than 1 lakh people to leave the house and homeland on some kind of assurance by Jagmohan that just go out, of course this fear, just go out and will cleanse the valley of these Muslims and then you come back, does not work. So for instance, if for instance Pakistan says today to Kashmiri Muslims, oh just leave the valley, we will fight the war and get you back. I don't think most Kashmiri Muslims are going to get it. So this whole idea of exodus, I do think that we have to be respectful of the experience of the many. That does not mean that there could be exaggeration. So there could be exaggeration even on stories of human rights abuses. But as researchers, as academics, as students, as whatever, and as also anyway, all of us, it's very important that we pay respect or we deal with humility on the narrative of suffering. But we also remember and remind that the suffering of one must not be used against the suffering of other. So in that context, what happens is suffering of both remains alive and the state manages with the divide and rule policy. But in my context is rather than difference, if I'm Kashmiri Muslim, rather than difference is that why did you not do it? Or maybe you just got a lot of jobs. And this is also rhetoric I've come across. Oh, you Kashmiri Pandit, they went out, they're settled now, they have nice life, they got a job and they got reservation and everything. My question response to them often is, why don't you also do the same? If that is that easy. And second, someone could do a bit of research on that is look at the houses in Srinagar. Right? Look at the houses in Srinagar that belong to Pandits. Find out who are the ones who took over the houses. In my work, it's not a study, but I had certain experience of going there, looking at it. From what I could see, a lot of owners happened to be Kashmiri police. Now, again, I'm not making, but it's not. Is it a coincidence that quite a few houses of Pandits went into the hand of Kashmiri Muslim police? It could be, and these things happen in conflict. That you generate more fear because then you get land easily. So broadly, it's a complicated story. It's a complicated story that has to be handled with sensitivity, including and especially by Kashmiri Muslims, because in the end, Kashmiri nationalism cannot be complete without minorities. And saying that why did Sikhs stay on and Pandits left, somehow Pandits are a problem and Sikhs are not, that ignores the justification, or even why did Pandits stay over. Again, if you pay close attention, not the media, go and speak to them, you find still there's a palpable fear, even among Sikhs. But they find it very hard to speak out in public, or they feel that they have to come out and talk against India because otherwise they will be in trouble. So there are different complex narratives there. And the third one was
what makes India believe that Kashmir?
What makes India believe?
We know that it's strategically important, but what other?
See, Kashmir is strategically crucial, but those of how many of you study international relations, broadly politics, IR politics? So, now, do you know of any region that's not strategically important? I mean, I know, I'm coming back. But this is important to keep in mind because this whole idea of strategic importance is also manufactured within states. I try to find out which region in the world is not strategically important. Every region is. Tibet, Balochistan, Delhi, Madhya Pradesh, every place in the region is strategically important. So that's there. Now India could claim, in fact, Kashmir, if anything, an independent Jammu and Kashmir would have most leverage against not India, against Pakistan, because the major river of Pakistan flows through Kashmir. So an independent Jammu and Kashmir has major leverage against Pakistan. And even I don't see therefore that Pakistan would be keen on Jammu and Kashmir being independent, because they would need the water resource. India does not need water resources in Kashmir. In fact, India does not need Kashmir. If you look at the way in which economy is structured, they can exploit it, but they don't really need it. They can manage without it. They could buy it from them, electricity, and leave it. But it needs, because that's part of the Indian nationalist narrative. It does not need Kashmir to be strategically important, though it is. It does not need Kashmir because there is resource it has. It needs Kashmir because the nationalist narrative that India made from 1947 onwards includes Kashmir as part of it. So now if we challenge that, then the idea will challenge the entire idea of nation-state project. So India believes that, but why do Indians believe? Most Indians don't know about Kashmir. That's the reality. Majority of Indians. Majority would not. So for me, going back to the first question that was asked about what can we do, I also think it's important to appeal to the humanity, and not only appeal to the humanity, but maybe work with those who are struggling for everyday life and those who are struggling for various forms of being along caste lines, religion lines, regional lines, against this behemoth and mammoth of Indian state, rather Indian being to a Brahmanical fascist state, to work in solidarity, to question this idea of what does being integral mean, and do we really, and even if we believe it should be part of it, does it really justify, are we justified in using all forms of abuses against people because we believe they are part of it?
Pakistan and from India, from the definition of India, there are discourses around Kashmir.
Yeah, so the question is about the divisions, all these divisions or academia in UK around Kashmir. Largely, there's hardly anybody interested in it. There is no division along Indian and Pakistani, like there is not that. So I said Indians and Pakistanis in certain contexts have given up on Kashmir. They think that the state is managing it, or they're not interested, or they think it's too tricky and complicated. But tricky and complicated would be those who don't want to justify human rights abuse, but why study it, so just ignore it. Now, even when we look at in recent times, the major conferences on Kashmir was done at my university. I was involved, our colleague Nitasha got for two of us, then we have a colleague in Warwick University, Goldie Osuri, so we often do it together. The last 3 to 4 years, most big conferences on Kashmir have been done by us. And through that we have come across who are the people interested in Kashmir and working in Kashmir. Interested a bit, not a lot, but a bit, working very few. So I do think that our university, that's my department, politics and IR and Westminster, is the only one that has 2 scholars working in Kashmir. That's the only one. Otherwise, there is no Indian Pakistani. Even most Pakistanis don't really see it as a serious issue. There are other things to look at, and therefore it does not work. So we are trying to generate more interest there, and we are doing that through students. But you can imagine that when students come across what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Democratic Republic of the Congo, what's happening in Kurdistan, Kashmir or Tibet, it looks not very significant. Right? That doesn't mean it's not there. And I'm even on one thing in Britain. After Indians, into ethnic minority population, after Indians, the largest population would have been of Kashmiris. But most Kashmiris sign as Pakistan, because they are from the Pakistan control side and they side with Pakistan. Now there are Kashmiris there who identify as Kashmir and are trying to get Kashmir recognized as an ethnic category. They did not succeed in census, but they are succeeding in certain councils, so certain areas. Now their biggest struggle, and I have interacted, their biggest struggle is against Pakistan, though they come from what was Pakistan controlled, and they believe that Pakistan is more active in trying to prevent that recognition, because if you recognize them as Kashmiris, then you also reduce the number of Pakistanis there. And what does, according to them, of course, they may know, but according to them, and these are many of them are ex-JKLF, they have been very much about freedom fighting, and they have been about socialism. So they were more followers of Marxist ideology, and they gave up on JKLF over time. Their idea is that this use of religion and community leaders to declare them as these individuals, and I'm talking even of politicians at lower level, to declare them as not very much Muslim, because they're secularists or socialists. So that dynamic is going on there, where what you have is many those who are part of broad Jammu and Kashmir, they don't identify as Kashmiris, or they know they are Kashmiris, but we don't really know what's happening, and they are trying to find it. So I don't see there are movements in SOAS has more active population student-wise, SOAS, King's College, in our context, academic, 3-4 universities trying to do it, trying to raise awareness. But in the near future, not much change would happen because a lot of Kashmiri organizations in the UK, not all of course, a lot of them are used by Pakistan and India. So those who are genuinely about Kashmiri movement, they get disenchanted from